early on, people, the U.S. in particular, was scared that if Honduras were to move to the left, if Honduras were to embrace socialism and communism, that they would lose their geopolitical stranglehold on the region.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
With Nicaragua, right on the border, that must help them somewhat. It's in resisting empire. I found it very interesting because I was listening to your discussion that you just posted with Comrade Libra and Josh last night about Sandinismo and about how Honduras used to be a training ground, your father's village specifically for the Contras, and now
Yeah.
it's the reverse where you have a socialist party in power, and now they can build with Nicaragua. So feel free to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, most definitely. So I think with Honduras geopolitically, it plays the role of being a bastion of imperialism and neo-colonialism in Central America because of its position. It borders Nicaragua, it borders Guatemala, El Salvador, it borders most of the Central American countries. So you have access to all of the different areas. During the 1950s and 60s, Honduras was used as the training ground for the coup against Jacobo Arbenz in 1956, 1954, 1956. I have to double check. But there was a coup against the Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz, who's leftist, progressive. This is, mind you, a few years before the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah.
This was one of the events that radicalized Che Guevara. So just to kind of give you an overview of the political position of Honduras, one of the most famous quotes from Ernesto Che Guevara in the early 1950s, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I swear before a portrait of Comrade Stalin that I will not rest until all of the tentacles of this capital imperialist octopus are destroyed." And that imperialist octopus that he was referring to was the United Fruit Company, which at the time was operating in Honduras. Honduras is the original banana republic. We've heard that term used before, the
Yeah.
banana republic, to basically represent a third world global south nation, small, poor, that is at the whims of US imperialism, that follows whatever US imperialism does. And it's just a place where is seen as a monocrop giant plantation.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the case of Honduras, as well as several other countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala. And so in 1950s, Jacobo Arbenz, who was a socialist, liberal, liberal, but socialist leaning, progressive leaning. He wasn't even fully a socialist.
Yeah.
He began trying to nationalize the banana industry in Guatemala, and United Fruit Company was very concerned about this because at the same time in the 1950s, there were a lot of communist uprisings in Honduras in the northern coast that they call the banana country, where my mother's from. And this is the same area where Che Guevara passed by on his way to Guatemala, where he said that quote of Comrade Stalin. So it has a very interesting history. It's one of the areas that helped to radicalize Ernesto Che Guevara. Ultimately, he ended up staying in Guatemala because of the Arbenz government, because of the freedom that there was for to be a communist at that time. The coup happened and he was ousted, right? This was one of the CIA's first big operations, Operation PB Success. Arbenz was ousted. Che went to Mexico. The communist movement in Honduras was extremely suppressed. There was a huge national strike on May 1st, 1956, one of the biggest against United Fruit Company. The communist movement there was very active. And so early on, people, the US in particular, was scared that if Honduras were to move to the left, if Honduras were to embrace socialism and communism, that they would lose their geopolitical stranglehold on the region. Because again, it has access to all of these different countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Belize. It's close to Cuba. It's just right across the Caribbean. So you have, and it's very similar, even if you look at a map as well of Colombia, like you have Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, because these two nations are somewhat at like the knees. They call, like Honduras, they say is the knee of
Yeah.
Central America. Colombia is kind of like the one of the joints that connects Central America to South America. So those are very crucial trading points. So the U.S. imperialists have made sure that those nations in particular have remained firm under their grip. So through the 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of repression against the communist left in Honduras. Into the 80s, after the triumph of the Sandinista revolution, what happens is that the US, Reagan, Carl Gershman of the National Endowment for Democracy, they all begin training these quote unquote pro democracy activists called the Contras, which are terrorists, violent terrorists who brought in drugs and cocaine from South America, who collaborated with the Colombian drug cartels, collaborated with the Mexican drug cartels, and landed cocaine into Little Rock, Arkansas airport, where Bill Clinton was governor at the time. This was part of the Iran-Contra scandal. And also the U.S. was funding, arming, and training these Contras in the hometown where my dad is based, Choluteca, which is on the border of Nicaragua. It's about 15, 20-minute drive from there. So growing up, my father would tell me a lot of these stories about the atrocities of the Contras, how they would roll up to bars and restaurants with sacks that said USAID. You know, like those rice sacks that they will send to like the Global South that says like USAID or whatever. Like they would have those bags with like cash and guns and like drugs.
That's wild.
And they would just roll up to places, kill people, do drugs. So they were like crazy. And if you get a chance, I have a video on my channel called From Contra Commander to Sandinista, where I interviewed a former Contra commander, a woman. Her name is Comandanta Chaparra. She was a former head of the Contras. And I sat down with her when I was in Nicaragua. I interviewed her. And now she's a Sandinista. Now she supports Daniel Ortega. She supports socialism because she saw everything that happened. She said that we were duped by the imperialists. They gave us cash and weapons one day, and then they just abandoned us the next once the press came out. And it was the Sandinistas who were there for her. So my father's hometown, Choluteca, and Honduras in general, was the base where the Contras were trained. She was trained there herself. And when I was talking with her, she was like, "Oh, I know all those places that you've been